Hi, Gene Monterastelli here, the editor of tappingqanda.com. The video that you are about to watch is a conversation that was a part of this year's 24 Hours of Tapping. The 24 Hours of Tapping is a fundraiser for the amazing work that is done by the Peaceful Heart Network. The Peaceful Heart Network has brought tapping to migrants, refugees, prisoners, and the underprivileged in over 30 countries all over the world. As you watch this video, if you learned something, if you were touched by it, if you were inspired by it, the easiest way to say thank you is to support the work of the Peaceful Heart Network. To do that, all you need to do is go to 24hoursoftapping.com/support. And as you look in the description and the first comment down below, you will see a direct link to that. I hope you enjoy this conversation. My next guest is Annetta Mallon. Annetta specializes in grief, loss, and trauma recovery. Trauma recovery psychotherapist, end-of-life consult, and educator, academic, social researcher, death literacy advocate, specialist in grief, loss, and trauma recovery psychotherapist. She works with grief, end of life, and advanced planning for people and pets. That is awesome. We are a very pro-pet place here. We love all of that. A passionate consumers' right advocate. Annetta is committed to ensuring a social model of learning in modeling in her work, and that death literacy is raised in her communities. Please, please, please welcome to the digital stage, Annetta. Hello.
G'day.
How are you doing?
Can you hear me?
I can. There seems to be just a small lag between your audio and your video, but we're going to get you there.
Okay, well, I am a long way away. I am in Tasmania. I'm coming to you from Palatory country in Lutruwita, Tasmania.
Wow.
In the central north, Kuparuna Nyara, which is the mountain of our spirits. So in a spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge all of the contributions made by the First Nations peoples of all of the lands where we join today. Thank you, Jean, for having me. I also pay my respects to those who are unable to attain elder status.
That's awesome. And I am sitting here in the ancestral lands of Lenape and the Canarsie people here on the very, very western tip of Long Island, just outside of New York City. And I love the fact that you continue to center that for us as we have these conversations, because it's so important to remember where we are and where we come from inside of all of this. So I appreciate you highlighting that.
And weirdly, I was born in Southampton.
Oh my gosh.
I was born in Southampton.
That's awesome. So
moved
as
to
we
Australia
jump
when I was a very little girl.
So one of the things that we've been doing as we've been jumping into these conversations is we have been starting from a place of what initially got you in touch with wanting to do all of this with grief. Because as my dyslexic brain poorly read your bio, looking into this idea of recognizing it's not just an experience of grief that I'm having in a moment, that you're looking at this thing in a much more comprehensive way. What was kind of the entry point for you to be interested in that?
I didn't want to move. I didn't want to leave my friends. So when I just turned 7, we moved to the other side of the world. And I was given a really hard time about the way that I sounded, about the way that I thought, the way I expressed myself. My identity, I didn't realize this at the time, but my identity had undergone a profound. I was in the room when someone died. And I was observing how with the direct family really stayed with me, because even though I didn't particularly like those people, this was my stepmother's mother, and I quite liked her. I wouldn't have wished the agony of such what I recognize now as poor death literacy, really poor communication, lots of family toxic secrets. And as I grew older and began to work as a military veterans, first responders, survivors of incest and rape and domestic violence, survivors of life-changing car accidents or industrial accidents, what I was hearing and what I was seeing people experience was remarkably similar to the way that we work with grief generally. And so for me, grief is not just about an immediate loss, and it's certainly not a short-term thing. I think it's very dangerous to try and pathologize anyone who is grieving, mourning, sad, affected by a loss or a death, but loss can take many forms. We have this idea in Western society that it's got to be finished in 2 weeks. Fine now. It was just a cat. It was something that happened last month. You're fine now. Grief is something that evolves and stays with us and changes forever because our relationship continues. So I think one of the most important things about any form of grief is that we talk about it. And I try and model that because my mother died yesterday. It was 10 weeks. Well, I was really interested listening to, I'm fine. I actually think, how are you is a really important question. So people would say, how are you? I'd say, well, my mother just died. Or my mother died 4 weeks ago. My mother died 6 weeks ago. It's, for me, the way that I'm processing is every week. But I sometimes have people come to me and they say, a work colleague, why am I feeling so sad? And they haven't realized that actually, well, they had some unprocessed feelings or some unacknowledged feelings, because there's a lot of disenfranchised grief, the grief that we don't feel safe or comfortable articulating, for example. We see this a lot in the LGBTIQA plus communities. We see it a lot with pet owners. I see it a lot with migrants. Also people that, oh, well, this person had a disability, so they're in a better place, or it must be a relief, which is appalling. Please don't ever say that. But then what do you do with all of this love and all of this grief and all of this emotion if you don't feel safe being real about that in your everyday life? So for me, it's something that made sense from the beginning. And I often see people because there's a re-triggering. I don't know if you want me to keep talking about that or give you examples.
Actually, I have a question that's kind of framing around this particular thing.
But I hope that I've answered your question.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about grief in that particular way, and you're talking about this idea of how it is not safe for us to be talking about that because the way other people respond, because it's so often when we think about grief and we think about how do we make a difference in the world with grief, it's like, I feel grief, I feel sad, and we're tapping on this thing that I am sad about. I had not ever thought about it explicitly where the context we are in impacts the way that we are allowed to acknowledge and respond to our grief. Why do you think it is that culturally we consistently create environments where it's not normative, appropriate, okay to do? Like, is it coming from like there was Well, a million years ago, when I lived in Washington, D.C., in this big house, on Friday nights, we would have parties. But I'm also someone who likes to go to bed early or not stay up super late. And I found the easiest way to clear the house out was just to start conversations about loneliness, and people would just flee. Because if you talk about pain, people lean in. It's like, oh, yeah, this sucks. And this is what's hard in my life as well. You start talking about loneliness and they're like, ooh, and two groups of people leave and the entire party breaks up. And so I'm curious, like, as you're doing this and as you're thinking about this, how, like, what is going on culturally? What is going on inside of me in responding to someone else that doesn't create that safe space or space in there for them to be able to process that particular piece of it?
The sociologist in me is deeply happy. The internal squee right now is enormous. Thank you. Great question. And whether or not you realize it, I think you've actually answered it for yourself. Okay. We have an awful lot of toxic masculinity. So there's a lot of patriarchy. As Monterastelli puts it, little patriarchies everywhere. And and I could be wrong, but the way that I am experiencing you is that you are white, quite possibly cis, male, able-bodied from the USA. You appear to be reasonably comfortable in your lifestyle, which makes you basically the apex of being a cis, possibly het, white, able-bodied male. And that is about performing masculinity. So pain is something that you can gut your way through, and it's something that you can write out, and it's something that you can use personship in a sense. So we see this a lot with military vets of all genders and experiences. We see this a lot with first responders. You can outperform. Loneliness goes into the vulnerable category. And unfortunately, we all live in the Western modern world with tropes around the idea that to be vulnerable is to be weak in a negative way, rather than vulnerable being very human and sharing an experience. The dinner party kind of person. I'm a little bit of an introvert. I like to be able to manage my peopling. So thank you for giving me an exit strategy in my pocket forever. But I think it's a lot of this is about changing the conversations and the mindsets around the idea that for men to older adults, children, everyone is allowed to be honest and vulnerable. I don't mean this in a manipulative sense. I don't mean this in a game-playing sense. But I'm being very honest when, for example, when people say, "How are you?" I'm terribly sad because my mother died. At about 5.5 weeks, I started getting a little bit of my own sense of humor back and started following that up with, well, my mum died unexpectedly. Rude, because there is a little part of me that is, how could you leave me? And this is someone who won at life. She was 90. She'd lived to see a great grandchild come into the world. She'd had a very rich and full and wonderful life. And I still miss my mum. And I'm very lucky. But I open up a space for people to talk about stuff, for people to, I like interrupting that automatic, "How are you?" "I'm fine, thanks." "Yeah, cruisy, mate. No worries. Great." In Australia, we do absence of vulnerability really terrifyingly well, and that's not good. We have very, very high suicide rates of young people at the moment, for example, and lots of psychologists who work in the community are not great in many communities at the moment, and also in professional communities. So practitioners are struggling because there's kind of a gag order on it. So I'm seeing and trying to support and work with people experiencing grief in all kinds of ways. And I think that it's a culture shift. It's going to take time, but I'd like to see loneliness being recognized as something that many of us experience. It's a very human thing. And you can feel lonely in a room full of people because there's an absence of connection, but it doesn't make us weak. It doesn't make us lesser.
And so then as we are navigating that, and I think that is
You're
all
frozen
like
at my end.
Yeah, it's catching up. You'll get me in just a second here. So as you're navigating that, then like, what does it look like then to actually create and hold that space? Because I love the idea. Yes, we want to create space so that we can have these conversations, be present to that thing. Awesome. Practicalist genes going, great, aspirational. How do I then do that in big and small ways? Because there's a difference between the way that I interact with an individual who's having a difficult day and the way that I just have conversation in my life where I'm seeding the fact that this is a safe place. I'm willing to listen, those sorts of things. How do we then educate, transform, show up in a way that is useful around that?
Again, great question. Thank you. I don't really do groups very often. I prefer one-to-one. That's where I think that's one of my strengths as a practitioner. But I do a lot of public education, which is perforce groups. So it doesn't matter if I'm speaking to you as a friend or as a therapist or as an educator. I bring two things to the table every single time. A lot of humor. I make jokes. I try and get people to laugh because when we've laughed in the body and a shift in breathing, that laughter brings us. And I think it's also really important to note that even in the depths of absolute devastation, when my mother died, for example, I was sitting with her body in the hospital room and I was going over jokes that I always used to say, Shady Pines, Ma, Shady Pines. We're big Golden Girls fans. If she didn't behave herself, I was going to throw her into, I wouldn't, but a nursing home. Or shall I put you to bed with a shovel of the back of your head because you're not behaving, Janie? When I go into talk, my favorite icebreaker joke is, why do we nail the casket lids down so hard? To keep the oncologists out. Everybody gets a cancer joke. Velcro your wrist to your forehead sort of experience of grief. It's going to be a very human conversation. The other thing that I do, not so much admittedly with clients, but when I'm addressing a group, I bring biscuits or cake. I bring something sweet. I literally sweeten my words. Lots of cultures do that. For example, if you know anyone from the Indian subcontinent and the way that they have gets-togethers and conversations, if you know anyone from both Eastern and Western Europe, come over and have a coffee, and there'll be some streusel, or there'll be a little petit four, or there'll be something. So we sweeten our words. And it's a little bit sneaky on my part because, if I'm feeding you, you can probably trust me. And that makes it safer to speak because when people are eating, are sitting here with our defenses down, we're actually making ourselves vulnerable, but in a positive way, because humans, when they're eating, actually quite vulnerable. Humans don't like to be observed eating or evacuating. That's when we're at our most vulnerable, apart from sleeping. So I try and build community. And when I'm doing grief work with clients and tapping. I wish I'd known about tapping when I started. It's such a fabulous tool. People can choose to work with me or another therapist when they need it. It gives them their own way, which is just extraordinary for grief. It's wonderful. I'm actually doing a Dying to Know Day event, August the 8th in Australia. Is Death Literacy Awareness Day. And I'm actually going to introduce a little bit, but getting people in history with their own discovered awareness. And they said, I can't get out of bed. I'm exhausted and I don't know what's wrong. I mean, I'm fine. And well, what's been going on? It turns out all three members of their immediate family, 18-month period, deal with all of that administration, they're processing all of that grief. And they hadn't thought about the fact that essentially they had lived through the equivalent of 3 natural disasters. So I said, okay, if you had lived through a volcanic eruption, a tsunami, and she said, no, I hadn't thought about it that way. I said, okay, so your emotional internal landscape has just had 3 natural disasters. Oh, so then it became tapping about the tiredness, but the tiredness was related to grief and how all of a sudden she felt isolated in terms of family. So there is identity folded into that. There is grief, but it's also about communication and changing the way that, in a sense, people stand point. So maybe if you're looking at it this way and you say, oh, well, but this is my life. I go, well, hang on, what if we just went this way? And combination with tapping and some gentle humor and lots of support and definitely going at people's own pace and allowing them their own moments of recognition and their own, all of a sudden, self-compassion comes out, self-awareness comes out, realizations come together that work really effectively. And that's lovely.
And so when you are talking about that and you're like framing it in that particular way, is that what you mean by when you're talking about death literacy? Are we just talking about like having an understanding, not just of this is a thing that happens to a human or a pet or something like that, but it's the understanding of the context and how it impacts us and how it impacts us culturally and how we change our identity and how we act and that sort of like, is that what you're like, is that what that means? It's not a vocabulary. Like I know both of those words. I'm making a stab at what I think a possible definition is inside of that particular thing. But is that what you're talking about when you're leaning in that particular direction, or am I missing the mark on that?
No, you're not missing the mark. Death literacy actually is an Australian coined by Dr. Kerry Noonan, who do research. What that's now evolved into is Literacy Institute. You can find Kerry, and that's, she spells her name with an I-E-O-N-A-N. And the Death Literacy Institute uses the Death Literacy Index as it's a robust data collection tool. But she discovered in the development of this that there's essentially 4 elements. There's understanding the systems around you. So your hospitals, your morgues, your own coroners, your own state, local, federal way of processing death from a sort of medico-legal standpoint, how to support other people and yourself. So that's a nice kind of positive up spiral. It's also the physical process that a person goes through as they're dying and then after death. And we've lost, and the fourth, sorry, I can't remember what the fourth went, but anyway, it's all of the regaining the understandings of the processes and proceedings and responses and physicality of death, which used to be common knowledge because 100 years ago, we all had that around us. It's been taken away and professionalized, and a lot of people end up spending a good deal of money. They have to, because the corporate funeral profession in particular makes a lot of money. I mean, we are 26 million people in Australia, and death is over $2 billion here. I think it's perhaps 23 billion in the USA. Like, it's big money. And one of the things that happens is that people's grief gets preyed on. And this is one of the ways that grief can be distorted, pretzeled into a really unnatural and unhealthy shape. So if a funeral director gives you a quick 30-second phone call, hi, just report, you might start wondering, oh, well, that was a really quick phone call. Maybe I'm supposed to be okay. There must be something wrong with me. And we're not talking about it. So nobody realizes that, yes, it's okay to keep talking to your dead dog or your dead brother, because the relationship goes on. They're dead, but the relationship may or may not stop for you. I sometimes still have conversations with my grandmother. I'm certainly occasionally just kind of going, well, Mom, kind of wish you were here because I'd really like to tell you about this funny thing that it's okay to still feel really sad. It's okay and perfectly normal for a significant part of the population to kind of be a little bit frozen and not necessarily process grief very much until you hit that first anniversary. Anniversary trigger places that say, oh, well, it's been a week, you're fine. Get on with it. What's wrong with you? There's lots of, sometimes it's a really hidden or taboo grief, like the disabled person. It might have been a really beloved child or sibling or parent or relative that made your life incredibly rich and joyous. And to have their death minimized is awful. So as we gain death literacy, we move sort of out of pain and performance, I hope, and into a more compassionate understanding what are within the wider community. And that kind of makes it better at avoiding some people who are always going to be really nasty or manipulative or vicious about it and just refuse to have compassion. Okay, so I'm going to avoid that person, but I know that I'm okay over here. So it also helps with healthy self-care, which is better for our mental and physical and psychosocial health in general. So it's kind of, it's big. I'm a sociologist, so I do go to some of the bigger frameworks. But then it's also, how do I see myself reflected in the bigger stuff and the bigger stuff reflecting me?
And so as you're describing that, and as you're talking about, the way people are responding in those particular settings, the thing that I am always afraid of in my life is that I am going to be acting from what I call kind-hearted incompetence, where in my mind, I think I am doing the good and helpful thing, but because I am coming from a undereducated or misinformed place, I then end up doing the exact wrong thing. So like the comment of having someone who has had a physical disability or a really hard life, it's like, oh, they're in a better place. Like on some level, I think I am being a good, thoughtful, helpful person by trying to comfort the person who is in front of me. And have been around death enough to know that, boy, is that the stupidest thing that I could say in that particular moment, because I am not being thoughtful. I'm not being generous. I'm not being that particular thing. So as we all of us, as we're having this conversation, are getting an opportunity to have a little more awareness. What are things that individuals who are navigating the world, because if I navigate the world and I have people in my life, then I have people in my life who are experiencing grief in big and small and complicated and simple ways as they're doing it. How do I be a better friend?
That's lovely. That's really generous. But I am going to stop you because you're not stupid.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, please don't ever call yourself stupid. You may make better informed choices about what you say, but please, the hardest thing for me, the most squirmy thing for me was to recognize that actually I was trying to make myself feel better. That was about making me feel better, not the other person. So I don't say I'm sorry for your loss. And I certainly would now, although I have, to my embarrassment, I have said it in the past, well, everything's better now. But what I will say is I'm sorry for your sorrow, because I'm recognizing I'm trying to recognize their experience. And what I do, say, let's get together for lunch. Because that's just it's like, what can I do for you now? I'm going to the grocery store. Would you like me to pick you something up? Can I make you a cup of tea? How about I fold this laundry for you? Very small, immediate, tangible things can be really helpful, because sometimes sitting in grief can be overwhelming, and even just taking the rubbish out to the bin might be too much. So doing something, or how about I pick your kids up from soccer tomorrow, because I'm going to be over that way anyway. I might not be, but that's one less thing that they need to do. Call me, I'm here for you, mean it. And maybe every week or two, check in, make a phone call, send a text. How are you? I'm thinking of you today. I saw a really beautiful sunrise, and it made me, I thought of you. I send lots of memes, and sometimes they're funny, but often it's just simply something along the lines of, wow, I'm really glad you're in my life. I'm really glad that I thought of you, and I'm sending you love or strength. I don't say things like I'm praying for you, because I'm an atheist. So I don't function that way. It's something meaningful for them. So I do try and meet people where they are. And I don't always get it right, but I try and not make it about me and me feeling better. They're in a better place. That's a way of going, I'm uncomfortable. Let's not talk about this. Is people saying to me, oh, well, you're a therapist, so you'd be used to this. And I think, how many female parents do this? Because it's different for me. It's personal. And all of it's interesting, internally to go, oh, all of my training went out the window. Everything just gone. I found myself going like, I'm not going to tap. No, I'm going to wallow in this. So I went through everything that, of course, I watch my clients go through, but I'm human, having a human experience.
And so one of the things that there's two things inside of your answer there that I just like, that I take away that I really, really love. The first is when you're talking about being helpful, every single example you gave of being helpful was phrased in the form of a question. And you're giving them the opportunity to have consent in the way that you are being helpful to them. And I think that that's like, those of us who are natural helpers want to rush in it. Like, let's take that back. As a natural helper, I am someone who is very good at solving problems, and I love to rush in and solve the problem. And David Rees, who is an American writer, one time said something that I loved. He said, help is only help when it is given in the manner in which it is asked. And so I really love this idea that you're asking permission to help in that way. The second thing that you did in all of your examples was you were saying ways that we stand next to the person, not trying to solve the problem, not trying to fix what's going on, but just being present in that particular way with them. And like, I can do that. I can be beside you. I might not be skilled and be able to handle and navigate those particular things, but I am capable of physical presence. I know that for a fact. I have a physical body. I can be physical present. And I love the fact that like both of those things are about the person. Both of those things are about not my needs, but their needs. And both of those are about creating a space where they get to choose in the way I get to be a helper. I'm not choosing the way that I am a helper.
Absolutely. Consent is key. And sometimes, like when you say physical presence, that's really important because sometimes talking is too much.
Yeah.
When people are really deep in grief, I do a lot of just tap and breathe. Tap and breathe. But with consent too, the words that come out, because I might assume because I'm an expert. I do this a lot. It never ceases to amaze me what comes out in terms of grief for people, because we don't know what that's wrapped up in childhood from young adulthood. There may be quite old formative scripts that are running, and that's the thing that's going to come out. So it may not be about this immediate grief. Sometimes it is. But just simply being with someone, and you can be in the digital age, it's great because we can be a physical presence in terms of supporting someone as we are on other sides of the world.
Right.
And so that's lovely. Hang on to that. I really like the way you phrased that. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Well, Annetta, I appreciate your time, but most importantly, for me, this is insightful in looking at this through the lens of the context and the experience of someone who's going through grief and how I am a part of that context because I exist in the world. And when I recognize that, I show up hopefully will show up in a really different way to the people in my life. And so I think like thinking about it in these terms, not just, oh, there is an emotion that we call grief. There is an experience that we call grief, but thinking about the person who's experiencing grief and how I can show up for them in their lives. Like that is such a good, useful, instructive thing for us. So I appreciate that disposition and insight.
Thank you. It's been a thrill and a genuine honor to be part of this. And I really enjoyed speaking with you, and thank you for sort of stretching, looking forward to the rest of the 24 hours. And thank you again.
Absolutely. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for your time. If you found this interview inspiring, I would encourage you to support the Peaceful Heart Network by going to 24hoursoftapping.com/support or clicking the link in the description. And you will see on the screen right now a playlist to all of the interviews from this year's and last year's 24 Hours of Tapping. I hope you enjoyed those as well.